you want to make a little art quilt without binding, you can either leave the raw edges, which doesn't look very nice, or you can sew a piece of fabric right sides together and turn it over. Then you have the problem that the stitching of the seam can show off on the edge. I show you here a method where you put the binding on the back of the quilt. This way you won't see the seam from the front. With this little art quilt I did a lot of machine quilting so that the piece is already very thick and stiff, and I didn't want to add another layer of fabric. Prepare the following pieces of fabric in a matching color. 4 strips about 2 to 2.5 inches wide and the length of your quilt. 4 squares of about 3 inches. Iron the strips in half lengthwise and the squares diagonally in half. Cut your art quilt square, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side. First put the half squares in the corners of the art quilt. Then add the strips with the raw edge to the raw edge of the quilt. Start about 3/8 inches from the corner and also end 3/8 inches before the next corner. Do this all around the quilt. Then you can start to sew. Sew all around the quilt with a seam allowance of 1/4 inch. In the corner, leave the sewing needle down for turning around. Iron the strips to the outside, but not the corner squares. Sew another round close to the seam on the binding strip so that the binding is attached to the seam allowance of the quilt. Clip the corners. And now turn the binding and the corner squares to the back. Work out the corners neatly. Pull the binding strips and corners to the back of the quilt and pin them so that the edge of the quilt shows on the back. When you have done this all around, iron carefully with steam and then sew the binding and corners by hand. And then you're finished.